This video was especially produced to help RotorWay builders properly install a secondary unit in a new aircraft. Note, if this is an upgrade and you are removing a secondary unit previously installed, it will be necessary to raise the rear portion of the oil bath. Remove the two bolts securing the oil bath to the airframe and cut the silicone between the airframe and oil bath. Note, it is not necessary to raise the large sprocket as shown here. This will allow you to raise the rear portion of the oil bath to remove the secondary and perform the alignment procedures. If this is a new aircraft installation and you are not familiar with the operation of the drive system, please read sections 11 through 16 in the construction manual. The secondary unit is just one of the components of the drive system. This video will concentrate on the installation and alignment procedures. The shaft of the secondary must be attached to the airframe square drive tubes unstressed. In other words, when the secondary unit is finally installed, there must never be any applied pressure to the shaft from misalignment of the upper and lower bearing assemblies. By following these instructions when making this alignment, it will allow for normal component wear and avoid high bearing temperatures. Misalignment of the shaft and bearings will lead to premature failure of the upper bearing and damage or failure of the shaft. Over the years, RotorWay International has produced several variations of secondary units. The most recent changes include shaft locking devices, upper bearing assemblies, and a larger shaft diameter. The most current version is a spherical bearing with a 35 mm shaft shown here. These alignment procedures will also apply to earlier versions, such as the two bearing types shown here. The main difference in the alignment procedures will be the use of spacers that are necessary to hold a spherical bearing perpendicular to the secondary shaft during the alignment. Note, the upper bearing housing on the secondary unit with the 35 mm shaft has a machined surface that is parallel to the mounting face of the housing. Remove the Zerk grease fitting to access this surface for alignment verification. Unpack the secondary unit. Before removing the tail rotor drive pulley, index the pulley in relation to the shaft. Carefully slide the lower bearing assembly off the shaft. If this is a new aircraft installation, the main rotor shaft must be installed before installing the secondary unit. The main shaft must be level, laterally and fore and aft, to the square drive tubes. Reference Section 8 of the construction manual for main shaft installation. The main drive sprocket and hub must also be installed on the main shaft. All three of the 3/8" bolts must be installed in the hub. Level the square drive tubes, fore and aft and laterally. Use shims under the skids as necessary. Here the builder is shown shimming the airframe laterally. Important, throughout the alignment procedure, use a quality digital protractor like the one shown here. This protractor is available from RotorWay International. Order part number E00-1600. Always check the protractor before each use to verify its accuracy. Follow the manufacturer's instructions. Check the surface of the lateral square tube where the upper and lower bearing flanges of the secondary unit are mounted. File any burrs that may be located on the surface near the bushings of the rear square tube. Mount the secondary to the airframe. Do not use any shims on the upper bearing housing at this time. Secure the secondary to the upper lateral square drive with the two 5/16" bolts. Since we are not using any shims at this time, Use several regular washers before adding the lock nuts. Use the two 5/16" fender washers on each of the bolts as shown. Lightly snug the bolts. Now center the secondary laterally on the airframe. Then tighten the bolts firmly. Install the spacers as shown. Flat stock is the best material for the spacers, as they are less likely to damage the surface on the bottom of the bearing housing. Spacers are only necessary if installing the spherical type bearing. Be sure to verify that the spacers are identical. Do not install the lower bearing assembly at this time. With the digital protractor, check the secondary unit fore and aft by placing the protractor on the machine surface of the housing. If the level does not read 90 degrees, this indicates a modification to the angle the upper bearing housing's mounting surface is necessary. If the bearing housing does not have a machine surface, place the digital level on the surface of the pulley and note the fore and aft reading. If the level does not read 0 degrees, the bearing mount surface must be modified. If this is a new aircraft installation, you can use a large square to determine how much material will need to be removed and confirm the angle. Remove the secondary from the airframe. Place the square on the main drive sprocket. Use clamps to hold the square in two places on the sprocket. With the edge of the precision square against the lateral square drive tube, look for a gap. Size and angle of the gap will vary from airframe to airframe. The gap is very small, so use a feeler gauge and very carefully insert it between the square and the lateral square drive tube. Note this blade, which is 3/1000ths of an inch, will pass between the square and the tube at the top, but will not pass through the bottom. This indicates the bearing housing's mounting surface must be filed from the bottom to the top, with the largest amount of material coming off the bottom. Note, every airframe will be different. If the gap was between the bottom of the precision square and the drive tube, it would be necessary to file at an angle from top to bottom of the bearing mount face, filing more off the top than the bottom. Before filing, protect the shaft with a cardboard tube to prevent any tools from scratching the surface. When correcting for the angular difference, correct the angle over the entire face of the bearing housing's mounting surface. Filing the entire face is important, as this is where the rigidity of mounting starts. Normally, only a small amount needs to be removed. You may find it necessary to check the fit and file the upper housing several times. Be aware it takes very little angular adjustment on the bearing housing to make a big difference in the alignment of the secondary to the square tube. It is imperative to continue this process until a secondary is level with the square drive tube and the protractor reads 90 degrees on the machine surface. Note, close enough is not acceptable. The protractor must read 90 degrees. Correcting for this gap is very important. Even though the gap may seem very small and if no action is taken, a large amount of stress will be placed on the shaft when the drive system is energized by the engine. It is imperative to continue this process until the secondary is level with the square drive tube and the protractor reads 90 degrees on the machine surface. At some point during the final fit of the secondary, it is a good idea to install the alternator water pump belt and the upper belt of the fan drive countershaft. It can be very frustrating to get the secondary perfectly aligned and then discover you need to loosen it from the airframe to install these belts. The main drive belts can be installed later. Once the digital protractor reads 0 fore and aft, place the protractor to check the secondary laterally. Loosen the two bolts and pivot the pulley to adjust it laterally. Torque the bolts and check the secondary pulley to be level in all directions. Before installing the small chain sprocket, the assembly must be clean and lightly oiled. This includes the screw threads and screw head bearing surfaces. Lubricate the inside wall of the sprocket and the locking device with engine oil. Coat the secondary shaft with a light film of engine oil. Carefully install the secondary sprocket on the secondary shaft, loose enough to slide it up and down. Note, when installing the secondary unit with this type of locking device, the small sprocket must be set 1/16 of an inch higher than the large sprocket. Use two 1/16 inch shims under the straight edge to set the proper alignment. The straight edge should be touching the large sprocket and small sprocket on all four faces. Now that the two sprockets are perfectly aligned, slide the lower bearing assembly into position. The top bearing flange should be slightly loose to allow the self-aligning bearing to seat properly. Use the bearing lock ring to hold the bearing assembly in place. When the flange is in the right position, tighten the two clamping bolts to hold the halves together. Note, make sure the lower bearing's position is high enough on the shaft. Verify this position by installing the bearing lock ring and then slide the tail rotor drive pulley on the shaft. Check that the bolt will install through the pulley and shaft. Shims are required to correct for the gap between the airframe and the bearing flange. Locate the assorted shims on E23 card 1F.